I had just stepped out of my 4th radiation treatment that week when I got the message from the office. Please report to conference room 14 at 2 p.m. Mandatory. No explanation, no call. Just one cold sentence, like a shipping update for something no one cared about. When I walked in, the room was silent and that unsettling, artificial way-bright LED lights reflected off the glass table, highlighting the fatigue on my face and the disinterest on hers. Cynthia Lorne, the deputy CFO of Halverton Industrial Group, didn't even glance up from her tablet. I'd spent nearly 2 decades in this company, and this was the send-off they thought I deserved. Due to departmental restructuring, your position is being eliminated, Cynthia said flatly, as if reading a weather report. No eye contact, no hesitation, just a verdict, read without emotion. I'm Samuel Breck, 61 years old, senior financial controller, former at a company I once believed I'd retire from. They handed me a cardboard box and a silent escort, a young security guard who followed me like a shadow. I didn't get angry, didn't protest, didn't beg. I just slipped on the worn jacket my late wife, Elizabeth, had bought me before cancer took her 5 years ago and walked out of that room like a man who had lost everything, but deep down, I knew they were the ones who should be worried. I hadn't spoken up for months, not when suspicious charges began creeping into departmental budgets, not when contracts were signed with companies no one could trace, and not when the most honest people on the team started disappearing under the vague excuse of early retirement. But they'd forgotten something critical. I kept the books. And I had never forgotten what Harold Halverton founder himself told me my first year. Numbers don't lie, Sam. People do. And I had the numbers, a whole drive full of them. I just didn't know yet. I was about to lose more than just a job. As I walked through the halls of Halverton Industrial for what I thought might be the last time, I couldn't help but notice how everyone suddenly became fascinated by their shoes, their coffee cups, or the scuffed tiles beneath their desks. These were people I had mentored, fought for during layoffs, covered for during audits now, unable to look me in the eye, afraid that even their silence might somehow implicate them. The only sound that followed me was the slow echo of my steps, and behind me, the low shuffle of Ben, the security guard assigned to escort me out. He was barely older than my grandson. I'm sorry, Mr. Breck, he whispered as we reached my office, trying not to meet my eyes. This wasn't my call. It never is, son, I replied gently, as I opened the drawer where I kept a small frame with Elizabeth's photo, wrapped it in the same soft cloth she'd used to clean her reading glasses, and placed it carefully into the box beside a coffee mug I never really liked but had kept out of habit. My keycard I left on the desk, but not the leather-bound folio I had carried for years, the one Elizabeth gave me on our 20th anniversary. Inside it was something far more valuable than any severance check they could offer. For the past 3 years, I had been quietly compiling documentation payment records that didn't align with inventory logs, contractor invoices that led to empty addresses or shell companies, audit requests that vanished from the system without explanation. At first, I told myself these were just growing pains, side effects of modernization, and new leadership. But the deeper I looked, the more obvious it became. Something was being hidden, and not just from the books, but from the people who relied on this company for their livelihoods. They thought getting rid of me would solve their problem that a 61-year-old accountant battling cancer wouldn't have the strength or clarity to fight back. What they didn't know was that their plan, however calculated, had only confirmed what I'd feared all along. I was never part of the future they were building. I was a relicone with a memory too sharp and a conscience too inconvenient. I hadn't always been this suspicious. In the early years, when Halverton was still run by Leonard Halverton himself, a man who made a point of shaking every hand on the factory floor before he touched a spreadsheet, I believed in the place. I believed that numbers told stories, and that my job was to make sure they told the truth. Numbers don't lie, Sam, Leonard used to say. People do. That's why we pay attention to both. I carried that principle with me through every quarter, every audit, every board presentation. But when Leonard sold the company to a group of venture investors 5 years ago, something shifted. At first, it was subtle budgets shaved just enough to raise an eyebrow, but not enough to raise alarms. Then came the management changes. New leadership with shiny resumes and cold ambition. Cynthia arrived from a tech conglomerate known more for its mergers than its morals. 6 months later, Brent Wallace came on board as Chief Operating Officer, bringing with him talk of strategic pivots and agile transformation, which, in plain terms, meant cost cutting and consolidation. I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt, even when the new supplier names started appearing vendors I'd never seen, billing for services no one could explain. When I flagged these issues during our quarterly review, Cynthia smiled a little too quickly and told me they were temporary partners, part of a global sourcing initiative, but nothing ever balanced. When I followed up with emails, I got silence or, worse, redirection. Then came the retreats. Lavish executive getaways approved under consulting budgets, expense reports with duplicate entries that somehow never triggered the automated systems, and payroll entries marked for employees who hadn't logged hours in months. I began keeping 2 sets of records, not because I intended to expose anyone, but because I couldn't shake the voice in my head, Leonard's voice, reminding me that truth wasn't just an ideal, it was a duty. The real blow came when they brought in Brent's nephew, a recent MBA graduate with 0 operational experience, and placed him between me and the final approvals on all financial documents. That was the moment I understood. They weren't just restructuring departments, they were isolating me, boxing me out from the flow of data, hoping I'd quietly fade into the background, or better yet, the grave. But they underestimated just how much I still had left in me. I started working later, not just to keep up, but to investigate quietly. I set up encrypted backups, cataloged every questionable transaction, and built a timeline of how policies were being rewritten to remove long-standing controls. I was careful, paranoid even, but not enough. Greg, a veteran from the purchasing team, stopped by my office one evening with a worried look and a whisper. "Sam, something's off. I'm seeing invoices that don't match what we've received." 2 weeks later, Greg was gone. The email announcement said performance-related departure, but his system login was disabled overnight and his desk was emptied before noon. That was when I stopped hoping the system would fix itself. At home, my daughter Emily noticed a change in me. "You're always working late, Dad," she said one night over dinner. "Is something wrong at work?" I told her it was just tax season. I didn't have the heart to tell her the truth, that the company I dedicated half my life to had turned into something unrecognizable, that it now functioned more like a cover operation than a family-run business, and that people I once trusted were orchestrating a betrayal that reached into the very foundation of our ethics. But I also couldn't let it go. Not yet. Not when I knew what was really happening, and especially not when I was running out of Timino just professionally, but personally. The treatments were helping, the doctor said, but nothing was guaranteed. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was trying to make peace with myself, and if that meant burning the last few bridges I had left to shine a light on what they'd done in the shadows, then so be it. They took my job. They tried to erase my legacy, but I still had my integrity. And before this was over, I would make damn sure that someone would be held accountable. There's a strange kind of silence that settles over you when everything familiar begins to shift, when the routine you once clung to for stability starts to feel hollow, like the rhythm of your life has fallen just a step out of sync. That silence had been growing in my home for years, long before the betrayal at Halverton, long before the numbers started whispering things no one else wanted to hear. It began the day Elizabeth's oncologist said the word terminal without flinching, and I realized that no amount of calculation or planning could prepare a man for watching the love of his life fade day by day in the same house where they once raised a child, built traditions, and made quiet promises over morning coffee. After she passed, the rooms grew larger, not physically, but in the way a space feels when there's no longer a voice calling out from the other side of it. The dinners I cooked were barely touched. The TV stayed off more than on, and the only sound most nights was the low hum of my desktop as I sat at the kitchen table long after I should have gone to bed, pretending to review quarterly reports, but really just trying to fill the hours. Work became not just a distraction, but a shield, something I could pour myself into so I wouldn't have to look too closely at what was left behind. And in the sterile comfort of spreadsheets and balance sheets, I found a strange kind of solace, one that dulled the pain enough to carry me through the worst days. Halverton back then still felt like a place that mattered. It was Leonard Halverton's company, and Leonard wasn't perfect, but he was decent. He believed in accountability, not just to shareholders, but to the people on the assembly floor. The receptionists, the truck drivers, people who wore the company badge, not just for a paycheck, but out of pride. He used to walk the line every Monday morning, shaking hands, asking questions that showed he listened, and he expected us in finance to be just as invested in the truth as those engineers were in their blueprints. "Keep the numbers honest, Sam," he told me once, patting my shoulder with a kind of fatherly weight. "When you let the little lies slide, the big ones don't seem so dangerous anymore." I carried that principle with me like a compass, even when Leonard retired and the suits from Belridge Holdings took over with promises of modernization and scale. The offices got sleeker, the meetings more abstract, and slowly, the old guard began to disappear, not all at once, but gradually, subtly, like a photo fading in sunlight. Some were pushed into early retirement. Others resigned quietly, sensing the storm long before it broke. And still, I stayed. Maybe because I believed someone had to, or maybe because I was too tired to start over. The first few changes were almost laughable, switching out vendors for cost efficiency, merging departments under glossy new titles, replacing seasoned managers with younger faces who knew the right buzzwords but none of the people. I gave them the benefit of the doubt. I told myself that transitions are messy, that maybe I was just being resistant to change. But the doubts crept in nonetheless, subtle at first, then sharper, like slivers under the skin. And still, I kept my head down, believing that if I just worked harder, kept the books clean, did the job the right way, I could outlast the chaos. What I didn't realize until much later was that doing the right thing had quietly made me a threat. I wasn't just another aging employee with outdated methods. I was the last witness to how things used to be, the last one left who still remembered the old rules, the old promises. And for people like Cynthia and Brent, that made me dangerous, not because I had power, but because I still had purpose. Looking back, I think the cancer diagnosis gave them the perfect excuse. They saw an opportunity to ease me out without confrontation, to frame it as compassionate downsizing, as if they were doing me a favor by letting me go before the chemo made me too slow or too sick to contribute. They didn't say it aloud, of course, but I saw in their eyes, in the way Brent began forwarding approvals without looping me in the way Cynthia stopped responding to anything that wasn't a mandatory compliance update. I was being erased in real time, pixel by pixel, until nothing of me remained but a job title and a salary they wanted off the books. But I stayed silent, not out of fear, but because some part of me still wanted to believe that the company I gave so much to could be saved from what it was becoming. I had watched Elizabeth fight her illness with grace and resolve, never once asking why, never once giving up on the days that still remained. If she could face her own ending with that kind of strength, I could face the unraveling of my career with something close to the same. So I kept documenting, quietly, precisely, methodically, every irregularity, every strange invoice, every consulting fee that had no backup. I didn't know then what I would do with it all. I just knew I had to do something, because even if no one else would remember how Halverton used to stand for integrity, I would. And if that meant sacrificing my comfort, my position, or even my peace of mind, then that was a price I was willing to pay, because the truth still mattered, and I wasn't ready to let it die in silence. It wasn't a single discovery that shifted my purpose, it was a pattern, one that revealed itself slowly, like ink bleeding through paper, faint at first, then impossible to ignore. At some point in that final year, I stopped hoping things would correct themselves and started recording what I saw, not as a concerned employee, but as a witness preparing for testimony. The truth had been there all along, hidden in plain sight in numbers that didn't reconcile, reports that contradicted one another, and authorizations granted without explanation, all buried under layers of executive polish designed to obscure rather than inform. The tipping point came when Brent's nephew, fresh out of business school and clueless in a way only the arrogant can be, was handed final review power over every budget line I had once managed. He didn't ask questions, didn't check sources, just approved whatever Brent handed down, no matter how inflated or vague the charges seemed. They'd effectively boxed me out from oversight, but they hadn't taken away my memory or my access to archived data, which I had methodically backed up off-site long before the restructuring even began. At home, I converted my small guest room into what I started calling the war room. A folding table held rolls of printed ledgers, spreadsheets, cross-referenced against internal memos and scanned invoices. I color-coded everything for missing documentation, yellow for questionable payments, and blue for policies rewritten to remove internal safeguards. It wasn't revenge I was planning. Not yet. It was insurance evidence of rot that, if left unchecked, would infect the entire company and take with it the futures of hundreds of honest workers who still believed their pensions would be waiting for them. It was around this time that Emily, my daughter, began to grow suspicious. "You've been on edge lately," she said one evening after stopping by with groceries. "And I know it's not just the treatments." I wanted to tell her everything, but I held back. Emily had just made partner at her firm, and the last thing she needed was to be dragged into a storm she didn't start. "Just tax season," I lied, pouring us both tea with a steadiness I no longer felt. But in truth, I knew the clock was ticking not just on my health, but on how long I had before they silenced me for good. I'd seen it happen to others. Greg, from purchasing, who'd flagged the first set of inconsistencies, was gone within 2 weeks of raising his concerns. His termination email cited performance issues, but his desk had been cleared out overnight, and his name scrubbed from internal communications before anyone could ask too many questions. That memory haunted me as I stared at the stack of flash drives growing in my desk drawer. Each contained backups of financial transactions, approval logs, and internal emails, some so blatant in their manipulation, it was hard to believe no one had caught them sooner. But that's how corruption works, not with fireworks or confessions, but with quiet compliance and carefully designed distractions. One particular file stood out, a series of payments to a firm called Darrow Consulting, supposedly for logistics analysis, though their listed address turned out to be a suburban house in a cul-de-sac outside Dayton registered under Brent Wallace's sister's name. That was the moment I stopped hesitating. Whatever doubts I had about what I was uncovering were replaced by something colder, sharper conviction that I could no longer pretend this was accidental or harmless. I drafted a detailed chronology, tying each payment to its authorizing manager, noting discrepancies between contract terms and fulfillment records, and mapping the timeline against the policy revisions that enabled them. I knew it wouldn't be enough on its own. I wasn't naive. These people had teams of lawyers and an entire HR department trained to sanitize exits and erase accountability. But if I could show a pattern, if I could prove this wasn't incompetence but willful misconduct, then maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. That someone, I realized, might be James. We'd shared a dorm room at Penn State 3 decades ago, and while our lives had taken different paths, me into corporate finance, him into federal prosecution, we had stayed loosely in touch over the years, mostly through birthday cards and holiday check-ins. He was now with the Department of Justice, specializing in white-collar crime. It wasn't an easy call to make, but after one particularly sleepless night, I picked up the phone and dialed his number, heart pounding as I waited for the tone. When he answered, I didn't launch into explanations or accusations. I simply said, "I think I found something. It's big, James, and I don't know who else to trust." There was a pause on the line long, thoughtful, then his voice, steady and calm. "Tell me everything." By the time we ended the call, I had emailed him a sanitized version of my findings and agreed to meet in person the following week. It was the first time in months I felt something other than dread. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was direction, and that was enough to keep me moving forward. They had taken nearly everything from Mimi title, my place in the company, the sense of purpose that had anchored me through personal loss and professional storms, but what they hadn't counted on was that I had nothing left to lose, and that made me dangerous. Because a man who's already stared down mortality doesn't scare easy, and he certainly doesn't forget. The first real sign that they knew what I was doing didn't come in the form of a knock at the door or a formal cease and desist letter. It came in whispers, the kind that don't travel through words, but through silence stretched too thin, through a car idling across the street just long enough to be noticed, through the way my home internet slowed to a crawl only when I was uploading encrypted files to a secure drive. I told myself I was being paranoid, that this was just stress playing tricks on me, that maybe I'd spent too many late nights piecing together a puzzle no one else seemed to see. But deep down, I knew better. The people I was going up against weren't careless. They were deliberate. And now, they were watching. 3 days after my call with James, I received a certified envelope from Halverton's legal department. Neatly folded inside was a revised severance agreement tone that offered a slight increase in payout, contingent upon my immediate signature on a sweeping confidentiality clause. The language was aggressive but coded in polite professionalism, crafted to sound generous while burying the threat between the lines. If I accepted, I'd get 5 months of salary. If I refused, they'd dispute my unemployment claim and withhold my accrued vacation payout. It wasn't a proposal, it was a warning dressed as a deal. I reviewed it carefully, noting how the wording had changed from the original draft. This time, they were trying to close all doors past, present, and future. No discussions, no disclosures, no exceptions. They wanted me silent. Not just about the misconduct, but about everything. Contracts, budgets, internal practices, even things I hadn't yet uncovered. The breadth of the gag order told me more than the letter itself ever could. They weren't trying to protect the company, they were trying to contain a fire they could no longer control. That same afternoon, Cynthia Lawrence showed up at my door. No prior call, no appointment, just a knock. And then her voice on the porch, bright and falsely warm. "Patrick," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, "I just wanted to check in. Make sure you're doing okay." I opened the door just wide enough to be polite, not trusting her presence or her timing. She stepped inside, uninvited but assured, and placed another copy of the agreement on my coffee table. "There's been some confusion. That's all. We're prepared to extend an additional 2 months of compensation, but we do need to finalize this quickly. The board is closing out financials for next quarter." Her tone was soft, but there was urgency beneath it, the kind you hear in people who are trying to outrun consequences. "What's the rush?" I asked, keeping my voice even. "Vendors to pay, reports to bury." Something flickered in her eyes, a brief involuntary break in composure, then vanished. "That's a dangerous accusation, Patrick," she said, suddenly all steel, "and frankly, one that could be considered defamatory." I didn't flinch. "I'm not accusing anyone. I'm just observing patterns, like how Darrow Consulting bills seem to match your brother-in-law's home address." She stood abruptly. Her smile was gone, replaced with something colder, harder. "I'd be very careful about what you imply," she said quietly, "especially if you removed any proprietary documents from company systems. That would be a serious breach." I met her stare without blinking. "I've retained copies of my work as permitted by the employee handbook. I'll give you until tomorrow," she said on her way out, "to reconsider the offer. After that, things may get complicated." She didn't have to elaborate. I already knew what complicated looked like. That evening, a text appeared on my phone from an unlisted number. "Back off if you know what's good for you. We know about the flash drive. No signature, no context. Just enough menace to chill the blood." Within hours, spam subscriptions flooded my email, over 70 confirmations for services I never signed up for, most requiring payment, all cluttering my inbox like digital smoke bombs meant to disorient and distract. The next morning, my bank called. Someone had attempted to access my accounts using my social security number and date of birth, but failed the password prompts. When I checked my front yard, the car from yesterday was gone, replaced by a different one that had parked at an angle just off the curb, facing my driveway. The driver never stepped out. I called James. "They're pushing back," I said, my voice tight. "Hard." He listened quietly, then answered with the calm of someone who'd seen worse, but never stopped taking it seriously. "Expected," he said, "but it confirms what we suspected. This isn't just shady accounting. It's bigger. Forward me everything, the revised NDA, the text, the access attempts. We need to start documenting escalation." I sent it all that night, every threat, every anomaly, every uneasy silence that now felt like part of the strategy. James's reply was brief but loaded. "We're going to need someone on the inside. Keep everything. Don't engage. And Patrick, watch your back." That final note stayed with me, not just because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. I was alone now, officially severed from the company, alienated from colleagues who wouldn't even acknowledge me in public, and caught in the crosshairs of people with far more to lose than I had ever imagined. And yet, even as the walls closed in, I felt something unfamiliar rising inside. Not fear, not anger, but a clarity I hadn't known I still possessed. They wanted me afraid. They wanted me isolated, broken, and desperate enough to accept whatever silence they were willing to buy. But what they didn't understand, what they never could understand, is that you can't intimidate a man who's already lost what mattered most. I had stood beside my wife as she took her final breath. I had buried 35 years of shared life with my own hands, and I had woken up every day since with an ache that no amount of money or manipulation could numb. So no, I wasn't going to sign their agreement, I wasn't going to delete the files, and I sure as hell wasn't going to back down. Because some people fight for power, some fight for revenge, but the most dangerous ones, they fight for the truth. A week after Cynthia's visit and the not-so-subtle threats that followed, I received a call from someone I hadn't expected to hear from. Again, Teresa Lang, my former executive assistant. Her voice was low, rushed, and punctuated by uneasy breaths, the kind you only hear from someone who's constantly looking over their shoulder. "Sam," she said, barely above a whisper, "we need to talk, but not over the phone, not at your house. Somewhere quiet, somewhere they wouldn't think to look. We agreed to meet at my brother's cabin 2 hours north in the woods near Sheffield. He was spending the winter in Arizona, and the place would be empty, save for the wind in the trees and the occasional deer wandering through the backyard." When she arrived, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She stepped out of her car, eyes scanning the driveway behind her, clutching a small flash drive like it was made of glass. "They're covering their tracks," she said as we sat at the old oak kitchen table. "Not just deleting files. They're rewriting them, creating new records, backdating approvals, fabricating paper trails. It's bigger than anything we thought." I listened without interrupting, the weight of her words settling into me like stone. She explained how they'd brought in outside consultants, compliance auditors, they were called, though she traced their LinkedIn profiles back to Wallace's former firm in Houston. These weren't auditors. They were fixer-shired to make everything look clean, even if that meant falsifying records that had once been clean to begin with. "They don't know I can still access the logs," she said. "I've been using your old admin credentials. They never revoked them." She handed me the drive. Inside were documents, originals and altered versions, side by side, each one timestamped and watermarked, showing beyond any doubt how the books were being manipulated. But that wasn't all. Her hands shook slightly as she opened a folder titled Retirement Accounts. What I saw next hit harder than anything I'd uncovered so far. Halverton Industrial had been quietly borrowing from the employee pension fund, funneling money to prop up inflated quarterly earnings, all while planning to sell off the manufacturing division to a private equity firm with no intention of honoring the company's long-term obligations. If the deal went through, hundreds of longtime employees, some of whom had worked there since I first walked through those doors, would wake up to find their retirement savings gone, their futures dismantled by a boardroom decision made behind closed doors. "Do you know how many people this will ruin?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Teresa nodded, her eyes wet but resolute. "They're betting no one will ever know until it's too late." And just like that, the game changed. This wasn't just about corporate fraud anymore. It wasn't just about me, or my name, or even Elizabeth's voice in my head urging me to do what was right. It was about people, real people, who had given their lives to this company, who had put their faith in a system that was now quietly erasing them. And I knew then that I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't. The next morning, I made 3 copies of every file Teresa had given. Meoni went into a safe deposit box under Emily's name, with instructions to open only if something happened to me. Another was encrypted and sent to James through a secure channel. And the third I kept on my person at all times. Then I made calls first to Greg from purchasing, then to 2 other former employees who'd quietly reached out after their own questionable exits. Each of them had seen pieces of the puzzle, but none had realized just how massive the picture really was. Now they did. Greg had already filed a police report after his laptop went missing during a break-in weeks after his termination. Another, Lena from logistics, had retained email threads showing internal pressure to approve faulty inventory shipments. One by one, they began to step forward cautiously, nervously, but with growing courage as if my resolve had given them permission to reclaim their voices. James called 2 days later. "The Department of Justice is ready," he said. "But if we want this to stick, we'll need a moment, something undeniable. A trap, if you're up for it." I didn't hesitate. "Set it." We chose a neutral location, the Lakeside Conference Center near Monroe, a quiet hotel often used by local executives for off-site meetings. The DOJ had already prepped the site with surveillance, audio, video, backups of backups, and briefed the team. My job was simple: bring them in, draw them out, and let their own arrogance do the rest. I called Cynthia under the guise of rethinking the offer. "I've been reflecting," I told her. deliberately softening my tone. "I'd like to discuss terms in person. Maybe I overreacted." Her response was immediate and smug. "I'm glad to hear that, Sam. Let's meet. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. The following morning, I arrived early. The room was already wired. Agents stood by in adjacent suites. Cynthia showed up with her attorney in tow, projecting warmth and reasonableness. She slid the new contract across the tableau, thick stack of legalese, polished and professional, promising silence in exchange for 5 months' salary. I read it carefully, pen in hand, pausing only once. "Just to confirm," I said, voice calm. "This agreement covers all company matters, including legacy obligations, vendor arrangements, and retirement holdings, yes?" Her attorney nodded. "It's standard." I nodded back. "Then just one more clarification. Would this agreement also absolve me of any duty to report federal crimes I've directly witnessed?" The room froze. Her smile faltered. "Sam," she began, but the door opened before she could finish. James entered, flanked by federal agents and 2 uniformed DOJ investigators. "Cynthia Lorne," one of them said firmly, "we have a warrant to search all Halverton industrial offices and seize records related to pension violations and federal contract fraud." She stood, stunned, as her attorney reached for his phone. Behind them, I could see the weight of years crashing down in real time. James placed a folder on the table. "This," he said quietly, "is only the beginning. The rest is with a grand jury." I didn't wait to see the end. I'd already done my part. I stepped outside into the cold morning air and breathed deeply for the first time in weeks, not because the battle was over, but because for one seat was no longer mine to fight alone. 6 months after the arrest at the Lakeside Conference Center, I found myself standing once again inside the factory floor at Halverton Industry, although it no longer bore that name. The steel walls were the same, the hum of machinery still familiar, but everything else had changed. The company had entered receivership shortly after the investigation became public, its assets frozen, its leadership either behind bars or in negotiation rooms, desperately trying to salvage what was left of their reputations. In their place stood something new, something harder to define but infinitely more honest. A coalition of former employees line workers, managers, engineers, and accountants had come together, backed by a state economic revitalization fund and driven by a shared refusal to let decades of integrity be erased by greed. They renamed it Redbridge Legacy Manufacturing in honor of the city that built it, not the executives who nearly destroyed it. And to my surprise, they asked me to come back not as an employee, but as a consultant, to help them rebuild the financial systems from the ground up, embedding safeguards, transparency, and the kind of accountability that should have been there all along. I accepted not out of pride, but out of a sense of responsibility. Some debts are moral, not monetary, and this was mine to pay. On my last day at the plant, I signed out at the front desk, and for a moment, everything came full circle. Ben, the same young security guard who had once walked me out in silence with his head lowered, now looked me square in the eye and said with quiet sincerity, "Mr. Breck, thank you for everything." I nodded, handed him my visitor badge, and stepped out into the late autumn air where the trees had begun their yearly fade into rust and gold. Emily waited in the car. She had driven up from the city to take me home, though she insisted I could have handled it myself. "How's it looking in there?" she asked as I settled into the passenger seat, her voice laced with curiosity and cautious pride. "They're going to be just fine," I said, glancing back at the facility through the rearview mirror. "They've got good people. They're building something real again." Leonard Halverton would have been proud. The drive home was quiet, but not heavy. The headlines had long since faded, replaced by newer scandals, fresher stories, and louder noise. But the legacy we protected wasn't meant to live in the news cycle. It was meant to endure in the paychecks that arrived on time, in the retirement accounts that finally matched their promises, and in the people who now came to work knowing they mattered. Some of the pension losses had been recovered. Not all, but enough that no one lost their home, and those closest to retirement could breathe again. Cynthia and Brent both faced trial. The CEO of Halverton, in a last-ditch effort to save himself, turned state's witness, confirming what our evidence had already made clear. There were plea deals, resignations, and public apologies. But the damage done could never be fully undone. That's the nature of betrayal. It leaves scars, not always visible, but permanent all the same. And yet, I had no regrets. Not for speaking out, not for refusing their hush money, not even for the nights I spent awake, wondering if a car parked outside meant more than just someone checking their GPS. I hadn't done it for revenge. I'd done it because it was right, because the people who built that company deserved to be remembered, not erased. Because Elizabeth would have told me to stand up, not back down. Because someone had to draw the line, and in the end, I was still strong enough to do it. That evening, I opened the drawer where I'd once kept files, flash drives, and notes, scribbled in the margins of expense reports. Now it held nothing but a new journal and a sealed envelope labeled "In Case of Legacy." I placed the journal beside it and closed the drawer, not to forget, but to release. The next morning, I started my new part-time role as a financial ethics advisor for the Regional Manufacturing Council. It wasn't flashy work, and it certainly didn't pay like corporate finance once did, but it mattered. I was helping other companies build walls where the old ones had crumbled, mentoring young professionals who thought integrity was just a slogan in onboarding slides. And for the first time in years, I felt useful in a way no title or office ever gave me. I still carry Elizabeth's photo in my wallet, and every now and then, I take it out not to mourn, but to remind myself that doing the right thing doesn't always mean winning, but it does mean you can live with yourself afterward. And that, at this point in life, is everything. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that truth still matters, that justice, though slow, can still arrive, then I hope you'll stick around. Subscribe to the Underdog's Revenge for more real stories of dignity, courage, and the quiet power of standing back up.